Alaska's Department of Corrections is now facing accusations that ICE detainees were exposed to tuberculosis this summer during their 23-day stay at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. DOC says all 41 ICE detainees were screened for TB when they arrived at the Anchorage jail on June 8th, and none tested positive for active TB. That's the contagious kind. But Alaska's news source has learned that one of those detainees began treatment for tuberculosis just 3 days after being returned to the Federal Northwest ICE Processing Center in Tacoma, Washington, raising some questions about where the TB was contracted and how it's being treated.
We're not sharing his name due to his concerns about potential retaliation, but he is sharing his medical records. Sean Quirk is the detainee's attorney.
The check-in process at Northwest ICE Processing Center in Tacoma took an extremely long time.
Quirk says his client and 34 other ICE detainees transferred from Anchorage to Tacoma on June 30th went through additional screenings upon arrival and then were placed in medical isolation.
They were told that there was some sort of exposure, but they didn't really know what was going on.
Quirk says he found out days later because he was denied access to his client.
The U.S. government effectively disappeared my client for over a week.
Unable to reach his client, Quirk became worried.
So I started cold calling hospitals and eventually located him at Tacoma General Hospital.
Medical records show his client was taken to the emergency room on July 7th, noting symptoms were acute onset of abdominal pain, nausea, and intractable vomiting, and that he was recently diagnosed with tuberculosis. On July 4th, during the time the detainee says he was in medical isolation and before his admission to the ER, medical records show he was prescribed a multi-drug tuberculosis treatment that can have serious side effects.
TB remains very much a public health priority.
I sat down with an epidemiologist at the Alaska Department of Health to find out more about how tuberculosis infections work.
It's important to realize that TB is unique in that it exists in kind of two different phases.
She told me TB spreads when someone with active tuberculosis speaks or coughs and the germ is breathed in. The Center for Disease Control says people will likely test positive within 2 to 8 weeks if they do get infected. However, not all forms of TB are considered active.
Most people who are exposed to someone with infectious TB, if they do get infected with the germ, will develop what's called inactive or latent TB infection. And that just means that their body is able to contain those TB germs, so they don't get sick from it, they don't have symptoms, they can't pass it on to others. And people can stay in that state for months to years to sometimes their entire life without progressing onto active TB disease.
In the case of Quirk's client, latent TB was confirmed, but active TB was ruled out by Tacoma General Hospital on July 9th after both X-rays and CT scans. Medical records show doctors discharged him, noting it was the medications making him sick. CDC guidelines say do not start latent TB infection treatment until TB disease is excluded.
Most people who are exposed to someone with active TB will never get infected. It really takes kind of ongoing, prolonged, close contact with that person.
While it's not confirmed when or where Quirk's client became exposed to TB, Dr. Rothoff says common tuberculosis screening tests have a known error rate.
The blood test and the skin test that we do for TB infection, that can be negative in about 20% of people with active TB.
And following our initial inquiry about Quirk's client, the Washington Health Department confirmed 7 suspected cases of tuberculosis at the Tacoma Detention Center and have started treatment. An ICE spokesperson says this is a false claim, but medical records prove at least one case was confirmed at the detention center that came through Anchorage.
Alaska has the highest rate of TB in the U.S., and it has had for years.
Alaska's Department of Health does not release data on infection rates for state-run facilities like the Anchorage jail.
Says his client continues to be treated for tuberculosis while remaining in ICE custody. And in a follow-up statement to Alaska news source, Quirk says he's doing okay and receiving care. I think it is outrageous. Transferred to a state prison in Alaska, only to return to Tacoma weeks later with this tuberculosis diagnosis. Our client wants the public to know that he and other detainees were exposed to tuberculosis while in ICE custody. At this point, only the authorities in Anchorage and Tacoma can answer where the TB originated. In email correspondence with me today, an ICE spokesperson offered to look further into Quirk's client's case. You as we learn more.